Let's talk about the F word. No, not that one. Fascist. It's a word that gets thrown around all the time, right? It's pretty much become the go-to insult to shout when you really, really disagree with someone. But what does it actually mean? Well, in this explainer, we're going to try to cut through all that noise. We're going to use our source material to build a very specific, clear definition so we can get a handle on what this incredibly loaded word is all about.
So that's the big question, isn't it? When is it actually appropriate to call someone a fascist? It is a heavy, heavy accusation. And according to our source, you really should only use it when you're sure that someone's worldview truly lines up with historical fascist movements. But to do that, you first need a solid definition. You know why conversations about this get so heated so fast? The source points out it's because people are often working from completely different playbooks. We're all using the same word, but nobody's agreed on what it means. So our goal here is to establish that common ground by digging into a specific academic framework for what fascism actually is. Okay, let's get right to it. We're about to look at the core definition from our source material. And just to be clear, this isn't about some vague feeling or a political jab. This is a specific academic term used to describe a very particular ideology. The term is palenetic ultra-nationalism. Yeah, it's a mouthful, I know, but let's break it down. That first word, palenetic, comes from the Greek word palingenesis, which just means rebirth. So at its absolute core, fascism is a revolutionary ideology that's totally obsessed with the idea of a national rebirth. So what does that really look like? Well, this ideology basically mashes a few key ingredients together. First, you've got this obsession with national purity and this belief in a mythic golden past that we've supposedly fallen from. Then, you mix in this powerful feeling that the nation has been humiliated and is under constant threat. And the solution? A revolutionary national rebirth, one that throws out both slow liberal reform and leftist ideas about class struggle. Now, this next part from the source is absolutely crucial. Fascism isn't like a switch that just gets flipped overnight. It's described as more of a political style, a process of radicalization. It's a journey, not a fixed destination. And this slide really shows you what that journey looks like. When we hear the word, our minds immediately jump to the end point, right? The jackbooted thugs, the concentration camps. But the source argues that it almost never starts that way. In fact, it often begins much more subtly, maybe as a protest movement that finds a home inside a bigger conservative coalition. So how does that actually happen? The source lays out this four-step process. It kicks off as a protest movement. Then it forms an alliance with traditional conservatives who might think, hey, we can work with these guys. From there, it uses a shared fear of the left to grab more and more influence. And in the final step, it basically hollows out that very same coalition from the inside, taking it over completely. This whole idea of forming alliances brings us to the source's next major point, a theory about a specific kind of weakness in the conservative political world. The argument here is that this dynamic makes some conservative movements uniquely vulnerable to being co-opted. Okay, but first, a super important clarification from the source. The argument is absolutely 100% not that all conservatives are fascists. Not even close. History is full of rock-solid conservatives who were fiercely anti-fascist. The source specifically brings up people like the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany and, of course, Winston Churchill in the UK. So what is this weakness the source is talking about? Well, it's an argument about an imbalance of fear. The theory goes that some conservative movements become way more afraid of perceived threats from the left, things the source calls phantom threats, like wokeness, than they are of actual rising radicalism and violence on their own side. It's this imbalance, this tilted scale, that fascists are said to exploit. And that dynamic leads to this really stark and, frankly, pretty chilling conclusion from the source. By the time many conservatives realize the true nature of their allies and finally decide to stand against them, the whole process of radicalization has gone too far. They become anti-fascists only when it's already too late to stop what's been put in motion. This creates what the source describes as a kind of tragic cycle. Conservatives might support fascists because they're so afraid of the left, thinking they can control them. But when those fascists actually take power and show their true colors, their former allies often wash their hands of it, claiming they had nothing to do with it, failing to see how their initial support made the whole thing possible. Okay, so we have this historical framework and this theory. How does any of this actually connect to the world we're living in right now? Well, let's look at how the source identifies the kind of language and talking points where this ideology can still pop up. According to the source, you can hear direct echoes of this stuff today. Take the Great Replacement theory. That speaks directly to that core fear of losing national purity. Or describing immigrants as invaders. That perfectly frames the nation as being under threat. And that obsession with so-called internal enemies? That's a classic tactic to define who's pure and who's supposedly corrupting the nation from within. So the source's bottom line is pretty blunt. When people use this kind of language, whether they realize it or not, they are explicitly echoing fascist talking points. They are tapping right into those core components of palenetic ultra-nationalism we talked about, the obsession with purity, the belief in a nation under threat, and the demand for a radical, revolutionary solution. And that brings us right back to where we started. If you can define the term, and if you can start to recognize the talking points, the source argues that this knowledge comes with a responsibility. So the question it leaves us with is, what exactly is that responsibility?